we need to talk about Mark Rutte. Hello, I'm Mark Galliotti, author and scholar specialising on modern Russia. And what follows will be an unscripted, unedited, and probably fairly unrestrained rant about the current NATO Secretary General and reasons why, for frankly, probably with the best intentions, why I think he's actually proving quite dangerous. First of all, we had Rutte before the recent NATO summit doing his roadshow, travelling around various European capitals, telling them why they had to sign up for this agreement to pledge 5% spending, 5% of GDP spending on defence. Now, first of all, let's just be clear. It's not 5%. It's 3.5%. The formula is 3.5% on defence, 1.5% on defence-related spending, which, given that this can be as elastic as to cover aid for Ukraine, resurfacing roads, rural broadband, you name it pretty much. Let's be clear, that's actually a sleight of hand so that Rutte could tell Donald Trump, you see, they've signed up to the 5% you wanted, whereas in fact it's 3.5%. But nonetheless, Rutte's pitch was, you better spend this, or otherwise you best learn Russian. In other words, holding up the bugbear of Russian invasion or vassalage, if this was not done. Come on. The country which has spent more than 3 years and still can only hold on to 20% of Ukraine is not also going to be in a position to take on the most powerful military alliance in the world, let alone roll as far as the UK or Spain or whatever. So this was, for me, already something of a dubious statement. However, look, I understand what he was doing. He's a politician, and he was trying to generate a degree of, I wouldn't say enthusiasm, but willingness to divert resources to defence, because this is not going to come free of charge. There is no spare money lying around. It's going to either involve more debt, in other words, just passing the cost particularly onto our children, or it's going to mean more taxes, and which politician wants to actually do that, or it's going to mean cuts in other aspects of public spending. There's pretty much no ways around that. I mean, you can try sleight of hand, but basically, this is all going to have to come at a cost. And so he's basically trying to say, look, the cost is worthwhile because otherwise we have big bad Putin who is going to roll across Europe. A pretty nonsensical claim, but an understandable, perhaps, political gambit. Still, it sits uneasily with me to actually have someone who is going to make rather outlandish claims. But look, I could be wrong. I appreciate that the Putin regime is hostile to the West, demonstrated be perfectly comfortable with the use of military force, and prone to do sometimes unpredictable things. So fine. Mark could well be wrong. It's certainly, I agree absolutely, that it's time for Europe to step up and in effect end its rather sort of childish dependence on the United States, grow up and take responsibility for its own security. Okay. Then we had around the NATO summit itself, Rutte's extraordinary fawning treatment of Donald Trump. The messages that Trump then dutifully relayed on social media, in which Rutte was telling Trump what an extraordinary triumph he'd had and that Europe will pay and paid big. And then later on, even indirectly basically referring to Trump as daddy. That really, really was not a good look. Now, again, I can understand the politics of that. People are saying, look, this is the nature of politics when you're dealing with a narcissist like Donald Trump. You have to speak in those kind of terms if you want to keep him connected to Europe, connected to NATO. And in effect, this was Rutte actually sacrificing his own dignity for the rest of us. Okay, again, I can take that point, but I have two serious political concerns about that. First of all, it really does consolidate the idea, and not just in Trump's mind, that in effect he is the world king and the European countries are simply vassal states who will obviously do whatever he tells them to do. I mean, generally this is how Trump seems to see the world anyway, that there's a handful of dominant states and the question about the rest is just simply who gets to give them orders. Do we really want to be playing into that? Do we really want to be encouraging him to think that that is actually our European relationship with him? And it's not just with him. I mean, the point is we are presenting ourselves as exactly the abject subjects to the rest of the world, not least to Vladimir Putin, who actually shares a very similar worldview naturally to Trump. That is, this very sort of 19th century colonial great power spheres of influence vision, in which exactly Russia and the United States and China and maybe one or two others are the great poles of the world, and everyone else is just a square on the game board. And the only question is, whose token is on that square, who controls them. At a very time when Europe is trying to assert its right to having its own voice heard, for example, whether it's over the current crisis in Israel, Gaza, and increasingly also Iran, or whether it's over Ukraine. At the same time, we are basically telling not just Trump, but the rest of the world, look, we in Europe, we're going to talk as if we matter, but we understand that we don't. And in fact, really all you have to do is have a word with the big guy in the White House, and that's all that really matters. I really don't think that's actually something that has been thought through and is useful. The second reason why I think it's kind of politically problematic, less significant, is this. Look, we have seen that the generosity, the gratitude of a figure like Donald Trump is a very, very questionable and temporary phenomenon. Yes, maybe it helped the low-fat NATO summit pass more easily. We didn't have any crises. We didn't have any sort of moments like when J.D. Vance stood up at the Munich Security Forum and basically said that as far as he was concerned, the biggest security concerns to Europe were from woke ideology, I'm paraphrasing here, woke ideology rather than Russia. But nonetheless, if your real measure of success is nothing catastrophic happened, then that does demonstrate a certain paucity of ambition. But now, most recently, we have had Rutte, and this is what really sort of triggered this particular outburst of mine, speaking apparently to the New York Times, again, a crucial American, one of the papers of record, saying, there's an increasing realization, and let's not be naive about this. If Xi Jinping would attack Taiwan, he would first make sure that he makes a call to his very junior partner in all of this, Vladimir Putin, residing in Moscow. Thanks very much, Rutte, for pointing out quite where Putin lives, and telling him, hey, I'm going to do this, and I need you to keep them busy in Europe by attacking NATO territory. That is most likely the way this will progress. His words, verbatim, well, apart from my little addition there. Well, let's start with the end. His claim, not just that this is a possibility that we need to be aware of or something like that, this is most likely the way it will progress. In other words, he's actually presenting this as the most credible scenario. If, and look, I'm not a sinologist, I'm not a China specialist. Nonetheless, there does seem to be a consensus that one way or the other, Xi Jinping is determined to see Taiwan brought back into Beijing's sway. And that may be politically, that may be economically, or that may be militarily. I have no idea. The likelihoods, the ways, the hows, the whens. But nonetheless, that he would make a call to his very junior partner and tell him to invade NATO. First of all, let's be absolutely clear about the very transactional and pragmatic nature of the relationship between China and Russia. Yes, they share certain common interests, essentially about undermining what they see as a global order, which was essentially created by the West for the West's own interests. But if you actually look at what's happened during the war in Ukraine, yes, China has supported Russia up to a point, but it's certainly by no means free of charge. What the Chinese have done for Russia has not been like Western aid to Ukraine, essentially a gift, a support. No, instead, Russia has had to pay for it politically, but above all, pay for it economically. If you look at the energy deals that have been struck, the Chinese have known that Putin is desperate to get these deals, and therefore they have squeezed a very hard bargain out of him. Likewise, although there is some degree of provision of so-called dual-use technologies, in other words, civilian ones that also have a military function, like trucks, for example, spare parts, again, for pay, and very carefully, the Chinese have not been providing ammunition or missiles or anything like that, even though there is some suggestion that they're getting a little bit closer to that line. Meanwhile, the Russian banking system has actually been finding the Chinese banks actually withdrawing from them. Generally speaking, this is not a straightforward case. The world is not like this. The world is not in a position where she can just basically ring up Putin and say, why not invade? Again, what I should stress is the world's most powerful military alliance, because it would be convenient for me. Putting aside the fact, actually, that the assets which will be consumed in any such war, in other words, the forces that will be busy fighting, if, God knows with what army, but nonetheless, if Putin did do something so deeply stupid and self-destructive, are not really the assets that European NATO could anyway usefully deploy to help support Taiwan. 1,000 tanks Poland is buying, extraordinary commitment to its own security. How would you get those tanks to Taiwan in the time frame necessary? How would you get them there safely? And then what would they do when they're there? So generally speaking, this just makes so little sense. Which means that I have to cope with what seem to me just two options. Option number one is that the Secretary General of NATO, this extraordinarily powerful, and let's be clear, extraordinarily successful engine of deterrence, is... I don't intended this to become such a rant, but nonetheless, let me lean into it, is a moron, or he's, again, disingenuously saying something that he knows isn't true, simply to try and build up this sense of an urgent, imminent crisis, which, after all, is not what is stated in the actual agreed declaration that came out of this most recent NATO summit. Now, the interesting thing is that I was at that summit, and I remember talking to someone who actually had personal dealings with Rutte on a number of occasions. And he essentially said, Rutte is not a fool, but he is a politician. Which I thought was an interesting juxtaposition, not least because we all know that there are a lot of politicians who are fools as well. But again, I think that is the answer. I think surely Rutte cannot be quite so misguided about Russian capacities, Russian intents and so forth, and just the relationship. That's not how the world works, that you just simply ring up and say, start a major war that could lead to a thermonuclear confrontation and the destruction of all life on Earth, because it would be handy to me to have someone like Putin say, fair enough, boss, I'll get right onto it. So instead, he's just basically continuing to be a politician and raise these bugbears for political intent. And this is my last real problem. NATO is not just a club of countries that have agreed to protect each other. NATO is meant to be something bigger, something more important than that, which is actually that it is this institution in defence of democracy. It's one of the basic preconditions for joining. And for me, democracy doesn't just simply mean that everyone gets to have a vote. If that was the case, you'd think of as Russia was a democracy. Nor does it mean that the vote gets counted honestly. No, it means that those votes have to be on the basis of an informed public debate. That people have to know what they're voting on, know what they're debating. And that demands a certain level of honesty between those people who are in positions of power, those people who expect to have the support of nations and national electorates, and the poor buggers at the bottom of the heap, which probably certainly includes me and probably includes you. The point at which you actually fully internalise this notion that because it's in a good cause, it's okay for me to lie and lie and lie again to the public, we are on this very slippery slope. I mean, one of the reasons why the West is currently in a period of, I think it's fair to say, democratic crisis. There's all sorts of reasons, in part because the democratic structures really are still based on 19th century notions of class identity and collective support and such like. But one of the reasons is precisely because we have politicians who lie to us, and we as the electorate let them get away with it, but nonetheless resent it, nonetheless increasingly are suspicious of it, and therefore we are looking for, or more susceptible to, new voices, people who say, no, I have the answer and I'm different, I'm not like them. So actually using this tactic may scare people into spending more money on defence. And yes, I need to restate that. I am not opposed to Europe spending more money on defence. It is overdue. My only issue is that defence needs to be conceptualised sort of sensibly. It's not just about tanks, guns and planes. It also should be about intelligence and counterintelligence and the like. So, nonetheless, I will come to my final point. Nonetheless, what this does mean is that in the name of security, in the name of defence, when I say we, no, him, Rutte, and all of those people who follow the same channel are essentially undermining the democratic principle which is meant to be at the heart of it. And that is why, at the end of this splenetic 16, 17 minutes of rant, I think we do need to talk about Mark Rutte and the things he himself is saying. Thanks very much indeed for your time.